Hello, Happy New Year and welcome to 2021 and welcome to the first new video for A Friend Remembers. And I wanted to make this video because I've had a lot of conversations with friends sort of trying to gauge how excited they are about, as we hopefully return to a bit more normality in 2021, one of the things I think some people are very excited about is the potential for cinemas to reopen. A lot of movies and franchises and other content got delayed in 2020. Some of it came out, a lot of it didn't. It's just been pushed back. So when we look at the history of cinema, 2020 could just be a blank year, a blank slate, where everything went on pause, and 2021 is when things restart. Or maybe that won't happen. Maybe what's happened has already been such a seismic shift that cinemas will never be the same again compared to what they were. Maybe the future really is digital, with more and more content going online and more of us streaming what we want on a day-to-day release. It's really not clear what's going to happen and what the new normal is going to be. But I think what is clear is, from a lot of conversations I've had with people, some of them are really excited about going back to the cinema, and other people are a little bit apathetic. They were not that excited by what was in the cinemas in 2019, and they don't see why it'd be any different in 2021. And one of the complaints constantly again is, where's the variety in my movies gone? Why is everything about superheroes? Now, it's been said before that if you go back over the decades in history, there are trends, there are franchises, there are things that come into fashion and go out of fashion. And people say, well, maybe superheroes are just the equivalent of what the cowboys film genre was. If you go back several decades, there was a period in time where almost every second movie was a cowboy film, when it was all about John Wayne and other famous actors doing movies set in the Wild West. And now there are hardly any cowboy movies. So maybe superheroes are going to be like that. But if that is changing, it's been hailed several times that we're at the end of an era, that this trend is going to pass over us, but there's not been any sign of that. And if that does happen, I think it's more likely to have been driven by what's happened to cinema as a whole in 2020 due to the coronavirus pandemic and everything else, as opposed to shifting tastes. So I wanted to pull up this graph and try and explain to some people and flesh out for the people who I was quite excited and I used to go to the cinema and watch films with, who are, some of them are very keen superhero cinemaphiles. Some of them really regret, why is everything a sequel? Why is everything about franchises? And why are most of the franchises about comic book characters? And I want to try and explain and understand why that happened. And this is designed really to take feelings out of it. If you love superhero movies, I like superhero movies. If you love them, that's great. If you don't love them, that's great. But there's a lot of misconceptions about that, and a lot of people saying, oh, this is the case, that's the case. And I really don't think that's always true. So I've got here a list of the box office returns for all of the MCU. This is Marvel's own studio. They started releasing movies in 2008, and from 2008 all the way up to 2019, there was a continuous unbroken run of movies released by this studio, and all of them had unimaginable box office returns. Really, when you look at cinema and the history of studio franchise, this is something we've not seen anything like for years. And I want to try and break down why the Marvel run of superhero movies really was unexpectedly impressive, just purely in terms of their returns. So these are the box office receipts of the Marvel movies, and you can see it comes out the gate fairly strong with over 500,000 for Iron Man. The Incredible Hulk, which wasn't actually produced by Marvel but is built into the franchise, less than half as impressive. But then they come back strong with Iron Man 2, fairly strong, just under 500,000 with 4, and then a bit of a dip for Captain America. And at the time, Captain America, you've got to remember, these really were unknown superheroes at the time. Iron Man, Captain America and 4, the reason Marvel opened with these movies is because these were the franchise that were not deemed profitable enough to sell off. Marvel had given away the rights to Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, their big hitters. They didn't own them anymore. Well, they owned the comic books, they didn't own the movie rights. So these are pretty impressive returns for the first Iron Man, Captain America and 4 movies. But then what they did after these individual movies building up their set of characters, they launched in 2012 with the Avengers franchise. And this is the first MCU movie to break over 1,000, essentially bringing $1 billion at the box office. And that's incredible. What's even more incredible is that the follow-up movie the following year, Iron Man 3, also cleared that boundary, even though it only had Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark in it. Then we've got a bit of a dip again with Thor 2, Captain America 2, a bit of an increase from Captain America 2, Guardians of the Galaxy. And this is the point where I think Guardians of the Galaxy, again, a really unknown franchise. Before this movie, a lot of people outside of comic books didn't have a clue who Peter Quill, Star-Lord, Rocket Raccoon or Groot or Gamora or Drax were. They'd never heard of these characters. So for a completely unknown franchise which pitched itself for sort of like Star Wars for the modern age, this is before Disney had relaunched Star Wars, remember, that movie really turned some heads. And then off that you hit this really incredible run. The second Avengers movie, back over that $1 billion at the box office. Ant-Man, small franchise, still even more, higher box office than almost any of their first 5 films. Then Civil War, you're back to this large ensemble cast, high returns. Doctor Strange, single character, Guardians of the Galaxy, Spider-Man, and you've just got this incredible upward trend. The only down point in these last few movies being the Ant-Man and the Wasp sequel, which only slightly outperformed the original Ant-Man and the Wasp, but it's still a pretty impressive box office return. But box office doesn't tell you anything. Box office tells you how much money the movie brought in and its cinema run. It doesn't tell you anything about streaming rights. It doesn't tell you anything about DVD or Blu-ray sales. It doesn't tell you anything about toy franchises and other associated media that they brought in. But what it does tell you is how much movie the cinema studio made back just on the production and wide distribution release of the film. And I think that's really important because films are expensive to make. Films cost a lot of money, and this is why studios have to think very carefully about what films and how many films they're going to produce, and even more importantly, how big those films are going to be. So let me put in here another graph for you. Let me load up what it looks like if you show the budget of these films. And as you can see, minus a few exceptions, these largely being the Avengers films, but not necessarily the first Avengers film. But minus a few exceptions, the budget for these films has remained fairly constant over the last decade and a half. Marvel has been putting more and more movie money into their movies, but they've had a impressive, really incredible increase in the box office returns besides the heavy hitters, the certainties, the one where they know the Avengers films they're going to get a big return. Besides those box office event films, they've not had to put that much more in terms of their budget. And what this allows you to work out is the return. Because there's an adage in the movie cinema industry that if a film is to be judged profitable, if the studio, because remember, the studio is having to put up a lot of money in the first place to finance the making of this film. And the adage goes that in order for a film to be judged profitable, it should return twice its initial budget. That's a bare minimum. So if I show this graph in green here, we can see the increase in the returns. Iron Man was incredible because there was this unknown character, unknown franchise, known to comic book audiences, but largely not the wider world, and you got a return of 4 times the initial budget. Hulk then, slight disappointment, under 2 times the return. But then the only other film in the entire MCU run after this point not to make 2 times the return is that initial Captain America movie. There's not been a single MCU film since Captain America not to make over 2 times the return back. And actually, if you take all of these movies across the entire run, you get an average return of about 4.4. That's impressive. That shows that this slate of superhero movies is reliably going to return the financiers, the investors, a return on their money. It means if you put money into making an MCU movie, you're going to get your money back with interest. It's a low risk investment. And the fact it's a low risk investment is why Marvel have been able to make so many of them. They've not hit a brick wall yet where they've actually reached the point where they're making so many that they're not getting back the money that they put in with interest. In fact, the more they make, the more the hype machine builds, the more return they seem to be getting. They're actually, if you look at the more recent films just over the last 3 or 4 years, you're averaging returns in 5 or 6 times that initial budget. And I said, that's a really interesting when you say that the initial budget hasn't been ballooning or skyrocketing over that period. If we go back to just the box office receipts, if you look at the trend line of all of these box office returns, we're starting with something that's just under 500,000, and we're ending up with something that is reliably, although the last few films, these are event films that probably are not reproducible if we return back to cinema the way it was. Maybe Endgame and Spider-Man, the last Spider-Man movie, really were the end of an era. But even if they weren't, it's arguable that it's going to be difficult to reproduce the circumstances around this tentpole movie that tied together the entire first 3 phases of Marvel. However, you're ending up with a trend line where you're increasing box office returns from under 500,000 to well over 1 million over just a decade period. And the thing to remember is that this movie, this studio, when we say MCU movies, we are perhaps being a bit disingenuous about what we mean by that, because the MCU is one series, and Endgame proved it's all interconnected. But actually, you've got a lot of different sub-franchises in there. I've spoken to people who really love Captain America, but they don't watch any other MCU movies. They just watch Captain America. I've spoken to people who just like the Ant-Man movies, just like the Spider-Man movies. And so you've got all of these different sub-franchises, and the really interesting thing about this interconnected hype machine that Marvel managed to build, the really interesting thing about the way they managed to tie all these movies together is all of these sub-franchises are growing. Even Ant-Man and the Wasp, which is the least profitable of their franchises, smaller movies, the second movie had a higher box office return than the first movie. The first movie was so well received and so interesting enough, and the general excitement about Ant-Man within the Marvel Cinematic Universe was high enough that more people saw the second movie than saw the first movie. For every single one of these sub-franchises to be showing year-on-year increases in box office returns is a phenomenon that we just haven't seen in cinema over the last 2 decades. Well, let's look at some other superhero movies. Let's look at some other Marvel properties which haven't been put out by this cinema studio. Here we have other Marvel film franchises such as Spider-Man and the X-Men. The different series: in orange is the box office returns, in blue is the initial budgets. And you can see that if you take all of these movies into account, the box office returns have been increasing. The trend line goes from an average of around 500,000 and ending up, that's from about the millennium, and in 2019, 2 decades later, we're ending up with a trend line average of 600,000. So whereas the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the movies put out by Marvel Studios more than doubled the average box office return over half this period, all of the other Marvel franchises, well, they've not been stagnating, but the average box office return has only increased by 1/5 compared to where they were. The budgets have gone up as well. In the millennium, the budgets were relatively meagre. They peaked in around 2006, and they've been fairly stable since then. And so let's look at the returns of these movies. Now, the Deadpool movies and the Venom movie immediately paints an interesting picture here, because they show fantastic return, but on what has to be acknowledged, relatively low budgets. All the other Spider-Man and X-Men movies, they've actually relatively been having a reduction in the average return. A reduction in the average return despite the fact that the budget is going up. So you have to put more money in, and you're still getting profit. You're still getting your money back with interest. Only the last X-Men movie actually didn't make that magic over 2 times return. You're putting more money in, and you're not guaranteed as much money back as you did, which makes the studios pause and question, should they really be making as many of these movies as they are? And if we cut Venom and the Deadpool movies out, we actually show here that the return is shrinking from an average of 4 to an average of only just over 2 over the 2 decades. So maybe, though, this is Marvel just cutting into their own audience. The Marvel studio has been so successful, of course it's natural that it's diminished interest in other film franchises. So, as I said, comic book superheroes do appear to have taken over cinema over these last 2 decades. So let's look at some other comic book superheroes. Let's look at the DC. Now, DC is a completely different comic book publisher. They own Batman and Superman. Now, these are the two most well-recognised comic book characters in history. And if we look here at the box office returns compared to the average budget of Batman and other DC movies over the last 2 decades, then what we can see here is that, well, Christopher Nolan's trilogy sets the benchmark for Batman. You've got an increasing budget from just under to 200,000 to approximately 300,000, but that's met with a box office return that goes from just under 400,000 all the way up to 2 movies in a row that break that billion. They predate what the MCU was doing by over a decade, and they've got similar returns. But the budget is a lot higher than what Marvel was doing. And then when we get to the DC Expanded Universe, we've got this run of films here where they try to lead into their own Justice League movie. And yes, the box office is impressive. A lot of people look at Justice League and say, well, it was a failure. And it was, because actually the peak we have here is Aquaman. Aquaman, which span out of that Justice League franchise, finally gave DC the return it wanted. The other trendline here, and the other film that brings the trendline up, is the Joker movie, which isn't strictly connected in the same way to the rest of the DC films. It was almost a much more of a spin-off. And Joker, importantly, had a much lower budget. So when we look at the returns for these films, we see Joker's got an incredibly, impressively high return of over 15. That movie, just in its cinema release, made back 15 times what it cost to make. That's incredible. None of the other DC Expanded Universe films are doing that. And if we cut Joker out, we can see the trend line here of across the average DC movies from the millennium up to 2019. The returns are increasing from 2 up to around 4. So yeah, no, the DC movies have been improving. They've been making more money back compared to what they went in with, but it's not replicated that incredible success that Marvel did. And there's been less movies over a much longer time frame. So that's all of the superhero movies we've seen across all of the superhero franchises, except for the X-Men franchise. There's been an increase in the box office, in the returns that the financiers behind these film studios have seen when making their movies. And that's why superheroes have suddenly become such a reliable bet for film studios to say, we'll make a superhero movie because you can guarantee that it's not going to flop, it's going to make you their money back. Not every superhero movie has done that. In the DC films here we can see Catwoman. That was a famous flop. It didn't even make its money back on the cinema film release, so that lost the studio money. And when you look at other film franchises, we can see here, now I've put together a list of, and we've collected together all of the big film franchises over the last 2 decades. So these are actually collectively the film franchises outside of Marvel and DC's roster that have made the most money in cinema history. We've got here the Harry Potter and Fantastic Beasts franchise, the universe that J.K. Rowling invented. We've got the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World series. We've got the modern Star Wars films from the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy, and the spin-offs from Disney. We've got the Middle-earth saga of Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films. We've got Tom Cruise's Mission Impossible series. We've got the Pirates of the Caribbean series. We've got the James Bond franchise from GoldenEye up to Spectre. We've got Stephanie Meyer's Twilight film book adaptations, which were marvelous. I mean, it's limited in terms of how many movies they could make, so it's not a permanent franchise, but they made such an impact on cinema studios when they came out. And then we've got the Fast and the Furious franchise, because how could we cut that one out? And when you put all of these franchises together, we can see it is not just comic book movies which are making more and more box office returns. It's not just comic book movies which are making back vast sums of money at the cinema. It is true to say that franchise movies are beginning to dominate cinema, but it's not just comic book movies. However, as I've said to you, sheer numbers of box office returns don't tell you everything. When you're actually looking at the perspective of these studios, when you're actually looking at what they need to go through in order to finance a movie, you need to look at the returns. You need to say, okay, they put the money up front to finance the making of this movie. How much money are they going to go back? And over these 2 decades, as you've seen the rise of Marvel superhero franchises and other comic book characters just begin to dominate cinema, we've seen the trend line for the returns of all of these series trend downwards. If you go back to the millennium, you've got a pretty consistent view that if you made any one of these franchises, made a film in one of these franchises, it was more than likely, the trend line says, that you'll get a return of around 6 times your initial investment. But here we are in 2019, and it's looking more like it's only going to be 4 times. That's still fantastic. That's still film studios patting themselves on the back and saying, this is brilliant. They've made their money back with interest. It's been a success. But it's not the same level of success. It's been decreasing steadily over the same period that superhero movies have been increasing. And this is part of the reason why we're seeing more and more rise and dominance of superhero movies, and why anyone out there who is annoyed that they want to go to cinema, they want to see good movies, but they're just not getting the variety. The landscape just seems to be dominated by these comic book characters. This is why. It's because even though all of the other franchises, it's not the case that they're not profitable, but they are less profitable than they were because they're being out-competed by superhero movies. But what if you don't like these franchises either? What if you're not a James Bond fan, a Fast and the Furious fan, Pirates of the Caribbean, Mission Impossible? What if you can't stand any of these movies? What if you just go to cinema to see one-off great movies, single movies that aren't part of a franchise? You just want to go in, switch off and see one great film and not care about anything else, not have to think about it after you've seen it or think about how it relates to everything else. What if you just want to go to cinema and see a great movie? Well, here is the other part of the problem. I've gone back to quite early on in this trend line. So let's go back a few years, looking at 2019, if it can be a bit distant. Let's go back to 2010. I've picked this movie out because I went to the cinema a lot in 2010. I went to cinema a lot, saw a lot of different movies, a lot of different people. And if I pick out all of the non-franchise and superhero movies, and I pick out all of the movies that came out in 2010 in American cinemas that I've not discussed, that I haven't looked at or mentioned at all so far. So they're not part of a comic book movie, they're not part of one of these ongoing franchises. And I just show you, released across the year, these are on the American release dates of a series of different movies. You've got in orange, box office returns of the movies, and in blue, the relative budgets that those movies needed, were financed by. So these are a range of different studios putting money in and getting box office returns of how well those films did in the cinema. And what we see when we look at the returns of those, so this is the box office divided by the budget, we can see that actually the average return, well, there's 2 immediate standout here. So if you look at the highest returns, well, the biggest ones are Black Swan and The King's Speech. Now, those were 2 of the main movies in view of Oscar Best Movie contention that year. So they distort the picture slightly. But below then, we've got in the middle here, we've got other films that had a high return value. We've got Inception. We've got 127 Hours. We've got Toy Story 3, True Grit, The Social Network, Winter's Bone, and The Kids Are All Right. All of these achieved a box office return with the exception of 127 Hours, all of them achieved a box office return of over 5. So, and that really does paint an interesting picture. In 2010, if you wanted to get an Oscar nomination for Best Movie, and now this is, of course, cutting out all of the comic book and other franchise movies, it's also cutting out a lot of other films that had high box office returns. So we're ignoring films like Despicable Me, we're ignoring films like Saw 3D and Resident Evil, which, to be fair, people's tastes in those movies will vary. But, the films which got Oscar nominations were ones that had high returns, that showed really strong investment from the general cinema-going audience. But not every film gets this investment from the cinema-going audience. Not every film gets a viral hit this way. If you take all of the films released in 2010 on this graph, and you say, what is the average return? It's about 4. And that's brilliant. That's absolutely fine. 4 is a great return. When you look at what's going on in the Marvel and the DC film franchises, 4 is fine. Of course it's competitive. But the thing to bear in mind is that over this period, 2010 is quite early on, back in 2010, the MCU average return was still just under 3. But since then, it's gone up and it's now well over 5. Whether that can possibly continue, given that we've passed the end of Phase 3 and the culmination of what Marvel's been building towards. But also, shape of cinema is going to change. I ignored New Mutants in the Fox graph earlier, in the X-Men graph, because I thought putting in 2020 cinema comparisons is, of course it's lower. Of course it's had less return. But if we plot the average return of these franchises, you can see here that an average return of 4 for a general movie, a non-franchise, non-superhero movie released in 2010, you've got an average return of about 4. And that is definitely competitive with the MCU. Even now, when you look at the entire Marvel film history, their average return is only 4.4. So, make a film and you have, on average, as much chance of making almost as much money back, even if it's not a comic book or a franchise movie. However, the standard deviation, the variation of your non-franchise movies are much higher. There are lots of non-franchise movies that don't make any return, but then they actually lose money. And then there are, one in a blue moon, these 2 movies that made 25 and 28 times their money back. If you cut them out, the average would shrink dramatically under 4. So across all of cinema, you have as much chance of making a movie, financing a movie, putting the money in, and making money, 4 times your invested money back. That's as comparable between the MCU and general going cinema. It's comparable between the MCU, Spider-Man, when it was before Sony went in with Marvel, the Sony Spider-Man alone movies, they're averaging return of over 4. The X-Men franchise, just ignoring New Movements, every other X-Men movie has an average of over 4. But the variation of the Spider-Man, the variation of the Fox X-Men franchises are much wider. You are as likely to get 4 times your money back, but that's on average. There are some films that will do less reliably. The MCU is incredible in its consistency, and that the variation of how much return you're going to get, it's almost never under 2. It's over standard deviation, so that's over 90% of the time you're going to get a return of around 4. Doesn't mean that the MCU movies are the most profitable in cinema, though. If we look at all these franchises, the 2 that really stand out, and I get it annoying, and a lot of people say that Jurassic Park is a lesser franchise. Now, it is a lesser franchise in terms of it's just a film franchise. There are not Jurassic Park comic book tours. The toy market is much smaller. There's not books, there's not comics, there's less TV shows. Jurassic Park is just a cinema franchise, but it's an amazingly profitable cinema franchise. If you look at all of the Jurassic Park movies, the average return is over 9. And the only other film franchise that could compete with that is the Twilight movies. There's a reason why when the Twilight film movies took off, they took off hard. And it got so much renewed interest because studios looked at this and they said, wow, look at that return. This is unheard of. No other film franchise can compete with that. Now, of course, the Twilight movies are based on the books, but it is just books and movies. There's nothing else to that franchise. Jurassic Park is just films, but it's an incredibly strong returning film franchise. Just below then, you've got the Middle-earth, again, books and movies. J.K. Rowling's books and movies. I suppose with Middle-earth and J.K. Rowling, you've got video games as well. But again, their movie franchises are incredibly strong. Potentially even stronger the MCU films. Critical difference, though. You don't get 3 J.K. Rowling movies a year. You don't get 3. You don't even get 1 Jurassic Park movie a year. These films are much more spread out. When they come out, they tend to be tentpole event releases. So not only does the MCU films make consistently 4 times their return back, they've been shown that they're able to sustainably do it up to 2020 3 times a year. And this consistency of return, the fact that investors and the people financing, ultimately Disney now, knows that when they make an MCU movie up to the coronavirus pandemic, they knew they could put the money in and they're going to see reliably healthy return on their films. This is why superheroes dominate cinema. And only other franchises like The Fast and the Furious and Mission Impossible and the James Bond series have a hope of competing with it. However, as I said, those movies can't come out 3 times a year. They can't even come out once every 2 years at the moment. The Bond franchise is increasingly becoming more and more sporadic between each film. And so this is really sort of the conclusion of whether you like superhero movies, whether you don't, that's down to personal taste. But if you're wondering why the world is in the shape it's in, why our current releases and the entertainment we're being spoon-fed is the kind of entertainment we're getting, these are the numbers that the studio bosses are looking at. This is what they're looking at when they're deciding what to finance, what to greenlight, what to put in production. Because this is what reliably gets audiences. Now, whether it's of the best possible quality or not, I don't know. That's down to taste. But I think it's very interesting when you sort of step back away from your own interpretation of what was good and what was bad, and actually just say, what did the audiences go for? What actually found an audience of people who went to go see it? What actually made the studio's money back and made them say, oh, this has got an audience, we'll make more of this? Well, it's not difficult to see why we're being flooded in superhero movies. And when will that bubble burst? Well, it's going to be very interesting going into 2021 when potentially cinemas reopen, but they're now going to be competing with streaming services. Maybe the bubble has burst. Maybe it hasn't. Whatever does happen, it's going to be interesting.